I'm going to be working through Lightroom as my base program today. The only reason that I'm using it is because I have all of my images in here, and I have a collection of photos that I'm going to be using for the demo today. Everything that we're going to be doing today in the photo suite and in Perfect Mask and Perfect Layers can be done no matter what version of the photo suite you have. So if you have the standalone, the Lightroom Aperture Edition, or even the Premium Edition, you can do all of the things that we're doing today in any of those. So just know that if you have that standard edition, or if you have all the way up to the Premium Edition, you can handle pretty much everything that we're going to be talking about today. I, again, just use Lightroom as a base program so that I have somewhere to start out with my images. Now, the first thing that I want to mention, when you're working inside a studio, one of the things that you're going to notice is I have two different backgrounds in some of my images here. I have a green screen and I have a gray backdrop. These are the two that are in the studio that I use, and they're the ones that I utilize the most. There's also a black backdrop as well as a white backdrop. Now, I recommend using the green screen. That's the one that I use the most. I find it easiest to pull a foreground from a background when using a green screen. The other background that I would recommend is definitely white. White backdrops, I think, are the best for removing it and replacing it with something else. The white is stark enough against, for the most part, what people are wearing, what people look like. No one has sheet white skin. And so I find that the white isn't as muddy as the gray. This image here I took, and it was on a gray backdrop because that was all that I had that day, but I would have much preferred to place it on a white backdrop. That white is bright enough and different enough from everything that he's wearing, whereas the gray can get muddied in. Gray can get mixed in with some of the lighter desaturated blues. It can even get mixed in with some people who maybe have a lower pigmented skin tone. So you may run into that problem. And that's one of the reasons why I love to use green screen. It's easy, it's simple. I know exactly what I'm removing. Most people don't wear this color of clothing, or if they do, I'll pull down a different backdrop. So just in case you ever have a chance to be able to use a green screen, definitely try it out. This is what I recommend. This is what we're going to be looking at today, and I think it's the most useful. So I also, just in case anybody asks, I don't actually use a real film green screen. I actually use just a green sheet of paper. It's a green roll paper. So it's not actually super fancy. It's very basic. It's a gigantic sheet of paper that I can stick up on my wall. So what we're going to be doing today is we are going to be combining multiple different images together. So I have this photo of the Oregon coast right here. I took an image of this girl in the studio holding a cup of tea, and I wanted to place her on the Oregon coast background, and here's what we ended up with. We're also going to be doing the same thing today. We're going to be combining this kind of bouquet background. This is actually part of our loyalty rewards program. This is a background that you guys can actually utilize yourselves. And then we're going to be combining it with this photo here. Again, it's another green screen photo. It's a little bit closer up, and I want to combine them together to create one unified image. So let's start out by taking these two photos here, and we're going to pull them together. Because I'm here inside of Lightroom, I'm going to select both of those images together, go up to my File menu and scroll down to Plugin Extras. And down here is Perfect Layers 8. That's where we're going to be starting out. You can also choose just plain Perfect Photo Suite 8. They're going to do the same thing. Now, there's an option down here in Lightroom, and this is also the same in Aperture if you're starting out in either of these programs. There's something called Open as Layers in Perfect Layers 8. These two options are really different, and they're important to note why. If you open both of these images as layers, they are going to be combined on the same layer stack, and that's great. That can be very helpful. If you choose the Perfect Layers 8 option, it opens them up as separate tabs, and it gives you the ability to combine and edit them separately if that's what you'd like to do. You can actually open multiple images and layers at a time on separate tabs so that you can go through and you can make adjustments to each one before you combine them together. So you'll want to go through and choose which option works best for you. I'm going to choose Perfect Layers 8. I'm going to open them separately just so I can talk you through how to combine them once you're inside Perfect Layers. Now, one of the other things that's very important is whether you would like this image here to be placed on your background image. This is my bouquet background, or whether I would like to place this bouquet in the background of this photo. And it seems a little strange for me to mention that at first, but one of the great examples of that is actually back here in Lightroom. You'll see that I was combining a horizontal image with a vertical image. Now, what I could have done is placed this girl right here with her cup on top of this photo and remained with that really nice horizontal image. However, you'll see that my final photo is actually vertical. I wanted to keep that vertical look of her holding the cup. I didn't want that horizontal full image, and so I decided to combine them this way. You have the option of doing both. Don't ever feel like if you're combining two photos that are of different proportions, you're going to get muddied or confused. So you can always go through and you can choose which orientation you're interested in. For this photo, I got lucky and they're both horizontal. There isn't much I need to do. So I'm going to go in and all I'm going to do is I have this image open right here. On the right hand side of my screen in my layer stack, you'll see there's only one layer, layer 0, and it's selected. I'm going to go up to the layer drop-down menu at the top of my screen and choose copy layer. Then I'm going to go up to my tabs at the top of my screen and select my background layer, go back up to the layer drop-down menu and choose paste layer. Now, one of the things that's really great is that these two are sized together. They're exactly the same size. There isn't much that I needed to do as far as resizing, which is really helpful. That isn't always going to be the case. So you do have a transform tool up in the top of your tool well here so that you can resize your image to make it fit with your background or your foreground, depending on what you're doing. Again, these two fit perfectly together. There isn't anything I need to do, but just in case you have access to a transform tool to scoot things around and fit them in place. And if I'd like to, I could technically make him a little bit bigger, or I could scoot him around if I want to. But for now, I'm going to leave it the way that it is. Now, once I have these two different layers in place, that's when we're going to go into Perfect Mask. Oh, before we go into Perfect Mask, and I know that this question will probably pop up because the last time I did this webinar, it did, and it's a great question. There's something here inside Perfect Layers called our Perfect Brush, and it's attached to our masking brush. This is pretty basic. It's creating a mask with our image here inside Layers. Now, the Perfect Brush is great. It's an edge detection brush, and it bases its information on color, which is very similar to what Mask does. However, it's a much simpler, much more basic version of what we're going to be using in Mask, and we're going to need more advanced tools. If I try and remove this background with the Perfect Brush, which I'm going to do right now, one of the things that you're going to end up with are these green halos around the edge of your mask, and you can see this kind of thin line of green right along his face. It does a pretty good job with some of the other areas, but you're still going to get this kind of strange green halo effect that's happening around the edge of your photo. And with the Perfect Brush, you can't go in and remove it. You also can't go in and do things like remove color casts, which is something that's going to happen pretty regularly when you're using a green screen or any other bright style of background. So there are two huge parts of this editing process that we can't do here in Layers. So the Perfect Brush is not really going to work out for us. So I like to mention that just so that you guys know that it is a great idea, but it's not the best option for something where you're going to need a couple more advanced tools. So let's go over to Mask. Now, I'm using the program very much like a standalone, so I'm just clicking through whichever program I need next. And once we're here in Mask, the best part about green screens is they're super easy to get rid of the bulk of them. All you need to do is choose the drop brush tool on the left-hand side in your tool well. You don't really need to change much as far as the refinement and the segment size for this tool. The green is stark enough from everything in the image that it's not going to go through and do anything crazy. So all I'm going to do is click and drag on the right-hand side and click and drag on the left-hand side. Now, one of the things that is great about this tool is there's an option called Auto Expand. It's right up at the top. We don't actually click it. I don't turn it on very often. One of the things that it's trying to do is it's trying to automatically expand the mask to try and remove as much as possible. But one of the things that I've noticed with this tool is that it expands too much and it has a hard time trying to figure out where the mask edge is. So I recommend that you leave this Auto Expand off so that you can get very precise and manually adjust the edges yourself without letting the software try and do it automatically for you. The segment size also is best left at its basic number 8 when you're working with a green screen. When you're working with a white backdrop or a gray backdrop, I would suggest maybe dropping it down a bit to 6. But again, because these backdrops are so stark from our foregrounds, there's not much we're going to have to worry about. Now, the segment size is something that it relates back to the color information in your image. So right now we're looking at our after photo. We've removed the bulk of our backdrop, and the segment size has separated the photo down into different color segments. So think of it like a posterized paint by numbers version of your photo. This is why shooting in a studio is so great. That background color is one color. The segment size really, again, doesn't matter that much because we don't have to go through and remove all of these little tiny colors. Imagine trying to remove this crazy orange, green, yellow, red backdrop instead. There are so many different colors in this background that we're looking at right now, this bouquet, that it would be much more difficult to remove. And so shooting in a studio is going to help cut down on that. Now, this little green halo edge is something that's actually very easy to get rid of. We have a couple different tools that we can do it with, but the one that I find works the best is right underneath your drop brush tool. It's called the Refine Brush tool. And this will refine the edge of the mask that you've already created with your drop brush tool. So that's what we're going to go through and remove with this. And we want to go in, and you saw when we used that perfect brush in layers that it was still there and we didn't have a tool to remove it. Here we do. And that's, again, why we come here into mask. So with the Refine Brush, the most important thing that I want to make sure I mention is the brush goes across the entire edge. You don't want to scoot it. I'm going to make it really big so we can see. You don't want to scoot it too close in towards the subject because it's going to get confused and try and figure out whether it's missing something in the center of your mask here. And you also don't want to pull it too close out towards the edge of the mask where the background is because it's going to think that it removed too much. So the Refine Brush really does work best when you run it right kind of along the center of the edge. So not too far out, not too far in. And then all you do is just click and drag, and it'll go in and it'll clean up that edge for you. I like to do it in kind of short segments where I go and I click and drag right along the edges here. It does a great job. You'll see that I'll zoom in a bit. You can see that it does a great job of hanging on to all of those little tiny hairs along the edge of his beard. This is one of my favorite parts about this tool is it goes in and it actually saves all of those tiny little hairs and little spots on the face, edges of fabric, and so on. And I'll do the same for running it along some of the smaller parts here to make sure that we remove as much as possible. We're going to run it along the edge of his shirt as well because we need to remove a little bit of the excess green that's there. And I'm just kind of running around the entire image, removing as much green as possible. It's also really great if the mask itself looks like it's been removed too much or too little, it'll try and clean up those edges for you. Now, there are a couple little problem spots. There's one that's right down here. It's actually hard to see at first. There's this weird little green pixel that just won't go away. And I have absolutely no idea why. For some reason, it's just not going away. And so there are a couple other tools that we can go in and we can clean up some of the edges that may not look quite right. The first one is something called your chisel tool. And this just works along the edge of your mask. It doesn't do any color decontamination. It doesn't pay attention to any of those segments that we've been working with. All it's doing is adding or subtracting from the edge of the mask. So you have two options here. You can either add in more information. So by choosing that option, if I click and drag, it's going to go in and add extra information on the edge. So as I paint it, you're seeing that it's adding more and more of his shirt. Or you can go in and you can remove. Just go up to your mode drop-down menu here and choose remove. And this will eat away at the edge of your mask. So all I'm going to do with this is just kind of click around right on that little dead pixel there that's down at the bottom. And I'm just very, very, very quickly running along the edge of his shirt to kind of remove some of that excess that was there. You can do the same thing if there are any other small spots around the edge of the mask. Like there's this little tiny spot right on the bottom of his ear that didn't quite get removed. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to kind of run my tool right along his face and remove some of that excess that was sitting there. And again, if there's a spot where unfortunately it didn't remove as much as you wanted, you can swap your mode back over to add, and you can add back in some of the information that may have gotten lost. Now, one of the other tools that's basic and very easy to use is just your basic masking brush. And this happens every once in a while. You'll see that the little spots on this mask aren't huge, so I'm kind of zooming in so I can really show them to you guys. But there's this weird little spot right along the edge of his shirt here that for some reason got partially removed. And this is technically a light grayish green-blue sweater, so I can understand that there might have been some confusion there, but there was this weird little spot here. Instead of going in and using all of these specialty tools, all I'm going to do is just click and paint with that plain masking brush. And I'm going to paint back in the part of the sweater that got removed. So they're very basic tools. They're very easy to use, but they're very, very, very powerful. Now, once we're done here and we've finished out and we've gone through and we've made our mask, click apply. Now we have a foreground and a background. We've got our subject on top of our background. However, we're looking at the photo and we're realizing that they don't actually go together very well. I would like them to go together. That would be really great. But I'm looking at them and I'm realizing that they look very disjointed. And that, again, is one of the things that happens. You end up with a foreground and a background that don't look like they're in unison. And it's obvious that these two photos weren't necessarily taken at the same time, but we want to make it less obvious. So we need to edit both of these images. Now, what's wonderful about working with a layered-based workflow is as we're here in Perfect Layers, I'm going to say the word layers and mask a million times today, you guys. We're looking at our layer stack and we're seeing that we have our foreground image, which is our subject, and our background image on those separate layers, which means we can choose them and edit them individually. So once we've already combined them together, I still want to make separate edits on each one of these. So we're going to start out with our foreground. We have the layer of our subject selected in our layer stack here. And all you do to select a layer is just click on it. So we've clicked on our subject layer. I'm going to jump up to Perfect Effects. And this is usually where I do a large portion of my editing on my images. It has all of the tools that I want. It has everything that I'm interested in. It does everything. So Effects is usually the program that I'm going to jump into once I've gone through and combined two images. So there are lots of different ways that we can make these two photos look a little bit better. The first is I want to make sure that I have the correct tone and contrast to my image. He looks a little light. This was shot in a studio with two lights, so he's obviously very well lit. This was shot at a pretty high shutter speed, a pretty low aperture, but it was also shot at a very low ISO, so I pulled in as much light as I possibly could, and he's way too well exposed. It's obviously fake. So I like to add a little bit of contrast and adjust the brightness or the exposure of my image to kind of fit better with the background. And one of my favorite ways of doing that is by going up and choosing something called our bleach bypass effect. And I think I use this like 50% of the time when I'm working on mask-based images, just because it has such a nice high contrast look to it, and I think that that's very useful. So I'm just going to go up and click on, in the bleach bypass category, I'm going to click on the top option. It's our normal one. And it adds, again, high contrast, lowers the saturation a little bit, but luckily in effects we have the filter options pane where we can make adjustments here. So the first is going to be the amount slider. This is adjusting the amount of bleach bypass that we're adding, so that high contrast, low saturation look. I'm going to move that down just a little bit so it's not quite so stark, so it looks just a bit more natural. I have brightness and contrast sliders, which are manual here, which is really nice. So I can actually darken the image a little bit, which I think it needs, maybe not quite that much, but I can go in and add that kind of darker fade to it. I want to make sure that he doesn't look quite as well exposed. And then I'm going to take the contrast slider and I'm going to move that over to the right a bit. I also have a detail slider, which is great. So I'm going to add a bit of detail to him to kind of crisp up some of the edges. Don't go too far because you're going to end up with something that looks, I don't usually use this style on a basic studio portrait. It adds kind of this high contrast tonal look to the entire photo, and it doesn't really work for this image. So I add just enough detail to make the edges look crisper, and that's pretty much it. And then there's also a saturation slider here. One of the things that happens when you're adding bleach bypass, and I'll move this over to the right so you can really see, is a lot of the colors in his face and even in his clothes are starting to get a bit more muted than they were. So I like to go in and add just a bit of saturation back into my image to make sure that I maintain things like his skin color so that he doesn't end up looking kind of emaciated and super pale. Now once we're done with this, we're pulling together the foreground and the background. They're starting to look a little bit more natural. This is what we started out with. It's very flat. And once we added that bleach bypass, we're getting a higher contrast. Now, we are going to edit the background in just a second, but one of the other things that I really love to do to pull a foreground and a background together is add some sort of unifying effect. And what I mean by that is something that is a very stark color or tonal-based adjustment that is very obvious. My favorite is the vintage filter, or adding some sort of color-based photo filter to the image that will unify your foreground and background. Especially with a background like this one that's soft focus, it's very easy to pull in. There's not much we're going to have to worry about as far as light sources and so on. So this is going to be pretty basic. My favorite is in the vintage category, and it's called Ocean Waves. It's this very, very light adjustment that's added. It's kind of a teal, warm yellow tone. I'll click to add it here. Now, as of right now, these two images don't look like they're matching up, but we are going to make them look a bit more unified. So just give it a couple minutes. I promise it's going to run together. So with the vintage filter, the amount slider just controls how intense you want the color that's added to your photo to be. And I don't want to go all the way over to 100, that's way too much, but dropping it down so I get just this little bit of kind of teal yellowy fade is perfect. The saturation slider will affect the saturation of your underlying image, which I want to make sure remains nice and intense and vibrant. And there we go. Now, all we've done are add these two layers, and we're going to go in and do something very similar to the background. However, before I exit the program, I want to save this as a preset. Because I'm bringing in basically another photo that is placed on the same layer stack, I want to be able to access this same filter stack again. I want to save the vintage effect that we applied so that we can replicate it exactly. And then I also want to go in and replicate that bleach bypass if I want to use it on my next photo. So I save a preset. It's going to be up in your preset drop-down menu. We'll choose Save Preset. I'm going to give it a very basic name, so we'll call this Studio Swap Webinar Preset, so I can remember what it's for. I need to place it in a category here. I have quite a few of my own that I've created. To do that, you'll add a new category, as well as a whole bunch that are included with effects when you get it. I'm going to place this in Liz's project presets. This is where the ones that I use for things like studio swaps and art projects that I'm working on. I can type in a creator and a description if I'd like and click create. Now it's already been created. That's all we need to do. I'm just going to go ahead and click apply, and it's going to bring us back into layers. Now the next thing that we need to do is edit our background. So I'll choose the background layer in my layer stack, and the same thing, we're going to switch and select effects. Now, once we've gone through and we're here, instead of jumping into all of the filters, we're going to go back over to our presets library, and we're going to scroll down to Liz's project presets, and there at the bottom is Studio Swap Webinar preset. We're going to click to add it, and already the photos are looking a little bit more unified here. They're looking like they're actually part of the same photo, and a lot of it is because we have that vintage effect that's being blankly applied across the entire image. Now, what's great about this is there may be other adjustments that I want to make to this background. So the first is, let's go down to this bleach bypass layer here, and I'm going to select it in my filter stack, and I'm going to make some other adjustments here. Let's say that I want to increase the amount of the bleach bypass. I'll move that over to the right. Let's say I want to darken the image a bit more. I think it's too bright. We'll move it over. I can take the contrast slider and scoot that to the left. I want a little less contrast in there. I don't want any detail on my background because it's a soft bokeh, so we're going to move the detail slider back to 0. And then the saturation slider, I'll go ahead and leave at 9. Even though we've made some minor adjustments to the filter options with the bleach bypass, because we have the vintage layer on top, which I'll click on to reveal again, I don't have to worry about the fact that these adjustments are going to be so severe that these photos aren't going to pull together. The last thing that I'm going to do is possibly adjust my vintage layer. I might add a little bit extra as far as the amount goes, or a little bit less depending on how the photos work together. So it's up to me what I think works. And then the last thing that I'm going to do here, and this is something that is universal, that is great for working with foregrounds and backgrounds, click the plus button and jump over to the filters library. And this is one of the reasons why we're separating the foreground and the background here. So this is one of the most important parts about editing these two individually, is something called our lens blur filter. This is a filter that I'm suspecting you guys may be familiar with if you're old users of the Perfect Photo Suite 7. We had a program called Focal Point, and we took all of the Focal Point technology and placed it here inside of Perfect Effects. All it's doing is it's giving you access to an advanced blur layer that has the ability to change things like the bokeh in the background, which this is already bokeh, but you'll see that these two circles or ovals that are on the left-hand side are really intense. They're very hard-edged, and I want to remove that hard edge because it's too stark against his face. So I want to soften it out, and the lens blur filter is going to let me do that. So there are a whole bunch of different options in here that we can select. My favorite for backgrounds is the bokeh in motion. It's perfect for this image, so go ahead and click to apply it. Now, one of the things that happens with this is once we've added it, down in the filter options pane, I can go through and make some manual adjustments here if I'd like to. You have the ability to adjust how much blur you want on your background, whether it be less or more. I'm going to pull it down so there's just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit because I just want to soften the edges of this circle on the left-hand side. I can adjust things like the amount of motion blur. So I'm going to pull this down, and you can actually, if you want to remove the motion blur, just drop that down to 0 and then adjust all of your other settings accordingly. So that's up to you. You can go in and you can change things like the aperture of the bokeh in your background. You have something called our blooming filter, which will add a blooming effect to the highlights and will make them a little bit brighter. There's also brightness or darkness in the areas that you're applying the blur. And then there's things like contrast and the ability to add film grain. So you have a whole bunch of different options here, but adding a bit of a soft blur to just make sure that any harsh edges are a little bit softer, that can be a really good option. And it's something that I would want to do on an individual background and not on my foreground. So this is one of the reasons why that separate application of our layers is very important. I'm going to go ahead and click apply, and we're pretty much done. Now, one of the important things about working with your foregrounds and your backgrounds on these separate layers is they're all individually adjustable. So this is our original background layer. It's down at the bottom. We went in and we added a new bokeh layer, which is going to be a little bit different. We went in and we added our foreground, which is our original foreground, and then we also had our after foreground. One of the last things that can be very important to taking a look at our image as a whole is unifying it together with something like a detail adjustment, a color adjustment like we've done with the vintage effect, a vignette, and so on. So we've pulled these two layers separately. Now we need to actually edit them together as a whole. So to do that, you're going to go up to your layer menu, and you're going to scroll down, make sure that the top layer is chosen in your layer stack, and select an option called a new stamped layer. What it's going to do is it's going to merge all of these layers that we've been looking at into one individual layer that we can now access as a whole. So for this photo, I've got the top layer selected now. It's my unified image. I'm just going to go ahead and click on Perfect Enhance to make some very basic adjustments, for instance, adding a vignette. And that's one last thing that's going to pull this photo together as a whole. So we'll choose the vignette option. I'm just going to select a basic one. We're going to choose subtle. I can change things like the size of it, maybe pull it in a tad. We'll adjust the roundness of it, maybe add more of a feathering to the edge. I can go up and do things like maybe I want to lighten or darken my image just a bit if I need to do that. We could add some universal detail to pull it together. We could maybe warm up the image if it's just still a little too cool, or maybe cool it back down if we need to go in and do that. Adjust things like vibrance or saturation, and so on. These are all one of the reasons why Enhance is great for this is because it's got all of these basic adjustments in some very simple panels on the right-hand side. So it's nice and easy to use when you're unifying two images together. And we'll go ahead and click apply. Now we started out with, I'm going to hide some of these layers so we can actually see what we started out with here. These are the layers that we started out with. A background and a foreground that were shot completely different times, completely separate, no unification at all. No way of pulling them together. And this is what we ended up with. Something that actually has a similar color across the entire image, has a similar contrast, has just enough softness in the background. He has enough detail to make it look like he pops out, but we have a unifying effect like a vignette to pull it all together into one image. Once I'm done here and I click save, it's going to go through and it's going to save this as a PSD file, which means that I'm going to have access to these layers if I would like to. So if I open this image up back into Perfect Layers, if I close out of this photo, open it back up into layers, all of this layered-based workflow information will still be there. That'll be the same if you open this image up into another layered-based workflow program like Photoshop, for instance. So that question will probably pop up, but as long as this is saved as a PSD file, all of this information that we've gone through and we've worked around is going to stay the same. So just in case you're wondering that, all that information is going to stick around. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this. This was our original background image, so we kind of came quite a ways, and we'll go ahead and close out of it, and we're going to jump back into Lightroom. Now, the last thing that I want to talk to you guys about today, and here, look, you can see our after image here popped up. So this is what we ended up with today. The last thing that I want to talk to you guys about today are color casts. This photo didn't have much of a color cast on it, so that green screen background wasn't necessarily something we had to worry about. He was very much removed from the green screen, so there wasn't a lot of pull off from the screen itself. But this image here does. And you're going to see a whole bunch of weird little green spots. Her tights are my favorite part of this photo because you can really see that green edge that's happening. And it's hard to see because of the green background right now, but you can see that there's this faint greenness that's happening on the entire photo. And it pops up in a couple of other places, like the edges of her rings right here. The edges of her hair have this faint green on them. And that is pretty typical when you're shooting green screen. So we're going to do something very quickly because I want to run you guys through. We're running out of time, but I want to make sure that I run you guys through so I can show you how to take an image like this one and combine it and remove that kind of green effect. And you'll see that on this final image here, there isn't any green along the edge. You're not paying attention to any of the green screen information that was on her. It's for the most part completely removed. So we're not looking at that green. Okay, so we're going to take our images. We've got our background and our foreground, and we're going to select both of them like we did before. Go to the File menu, Plug in Extras, and this time I'm going to choose Perfect Layers 8 again because I want to be able to choose whether I want to place her on that horizontal image or whether I want to slim this down to more of a vertical style. I'm going to go ahead and just so I can show you guys how this works, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take this image and paste it on the horizontal photo because let's say I want to keep that format and just kind of place her strategically over these people who are unfortunately standing on my nice beach. These people were in the way and I was trying to take a photo without them and then they wandered over. People trying to enjoy themselves, they just ruin photos. So I'm going to take her and I'm going to place them kind of strategically over those people so we can make it look like they weren't actually there. It was just me and her drinking a cup of coffee on the beach for some reason. So I'll go up to my layer drop-down menu, choose copy layer because there's only one layer on this photo. It's this original image. I haven't done anything to this photo, you guys. This is straight out of camera. So I want to make that very clear that I'm not doing anything to these photos before I'm bringing them in here. I haven't done any portrait editing. I haven't done any adjustments to her whatsoever. So this is, again, straight out of camera. We're copying our layer. We are choosing our background layer, go up to our layer menu, and choose paste layer. Now, she is kind of a strange proportion for this image. So we have two different options here. It's not going to make much of a difference if we don't resize her and make her smaller. I can go into Mask right now and just pop her into the program, remove the background. Because we can't see the top of this layer where the rest of that green is, it's not going to make a difference here. I like to size her and make her look a little bit more like where she's supposed to be on the photo, and that's just my personal preference. I prefer that. So I've got my transform tool selected. You'll see a bounding box around the edge of my layer here, the one that I have selected. The icon that you're looking at right now gives me the ability to rotate my layer if I want to, but I'm going to hover my mouse over the edge of my bounding box, hold down the Shift key on my keyboard to constrain the proportions as I resize her, and I'm just going to shrink her down a little bit because she's not going to be that huge on the background there. And then I'm just going to kind of scoot her over. I want her to be quite a bit smaller. I'm going to pop her down just a little bit, cut off a couple of her legs. She's not going to mind, I promise. And that's pretty much it. I want her to be smaller and kind of off-center. Go up to the Tool Options bar on the right-hand side and click Apply, and then those adjustments will be saved. So I've resized her, she's in place. Now I'm ready to actually edit my image and take it into Mask. So I've got my studio image selected. I'll click on Mask here. And one of the great things about this is you have your zoom and your hand tools here. So you can go in and you can access which part of the image you need to look at to mask out. So I'm just kind of zooming in and pulling over to where she is in the photo. I don't need to be completely zoomed out and look at the entire image. I want to make sure that I'm getting clean margins on my mask. So even though I may have resized her a little bit, I can scoot in and get a little bit closer to make sure that my mask looks good. Now, right here up at the top left-hand side, we're doing the same thing that we did before with the green screen. We're choosing the drop brush tool and just clicking once to remove the background. Because they're on separate layers, it's not going to affect the beach background that we're looking at, so we don't have to worry about that. I'm going to go in and zoom in a bit so that we can do what we did before. We're going to use our refine brush tool. Now, for the refine brush tool, one of the things that I didn't mention before is something called the color decontamination box. And you're going to see it up here. And again, it's one of those options that just seems to not ever get talked about. And I like to use it quite a bit when I'm accessing the refine brush tool. And part of the reason why is because we're working with a bright green backdrop. So we're looking at this and you're trying to remove this very, very stark color. And the color decontamination is really helpful because there's a small amount of color remaining around the edge of your mask. Now, it seems kind of weird when we're talking about this because that's what the refine brush is supposed to do, but the color decontamination pays more attention to the color differences. The regular refine brush without this box checked just pays attention to the difference between the foreground and the background and your mask edge. Color decontamination pays more attention to the stark color information along the edge of your mask. So they have a very slight difference, and hopefully that does make sense, but this box can be very helpful when you're working with photos that have that kind of very crazy bright color hue along the edge of the mask that you're creating. I almost exclusively use it on images that are green screened. We also have a blue screen in our studio. The back of our studio wall is painted bright blue. So I do blue screen and green screen, and I use the color decontamination for both of the images that I use in the studio. So just as a heads up. I turn this off when I'm working with images that have a white or gray backdrop. All right, so I'm just going to do what we did before. We are going to click and drag along the edge of her hair. It's going to go through and remove the bulk of the green. We're going to do the same on the left-hand side. There are still going to be spots that we're going to need to go in and clean up, just so you know. We obviously have a whole bunch along the edge of her jacket here that we're going to need to remove. I'm going to do this very quickly and not be extremely exact because I want to make sure I show you guys how to remove color information. So I'm just going to very quickly kind of run along the edge here. Now, the refine brush works great most of the time. Sometimes I like to go in with the chisel tool. And the chisel tool I find very useful because every once in a while the refine brush is going to do something like this, where it's going to cut out too much information. And that happens quite a bit. I honestly don't always know why it does that for some photos and not the other. But that is, again, one of the reasons why the chisel tool is so useful. So for this image, I'm going to chisel away the edge of her without using that refine brush. It works great for the hair. It did a wonderful job right along her hairline, but it didn't do the best job along her jacket. Now, before I use the chisel tool, the most important thing up here is going to be your hardness slider. If it's all the way up at 100, you're going to get a very soft edge when you chisel away your pixels. When you lower the hardness down, you're going to get a harsher edge as you remove the pixels. So it's basically, the hardness just references the feathering along the edge that you're removing. Also, the amount slider is how much you're going to remove. If I push this all the way up completely, it's going to add or remove a ton. I mean, look at all that green that we're adding back in. But if I go in and I lower the amount back down, it's only going to add in a tiny bit. So you can see there's a very large difference there. So the amount slider is going to, again, reference how much you're adding or subtracting. So once I've got it all set, I'm just going to click and remove that green edge very, very easily. There may be some areas that you'll have to click and drag more than once because the edge might have been a little bit larger, but I'm just going up very quickly and kind of removing through some of that stuff. I'm going to do the same up here near where her hair is to kind of get rid of all of that excess green that may have been left, and there we go. Now, once we've gone in and we've removed the edge, the last thing that's going to be here is the greenness that's left. And the position of this image is a little strange. We're looking at her legs right here, but you'll see that on the color of her tights, there's that green hue that we're talking about, and it's really, really awful. So we have something here, it's called our color spill brush. And the color spill tool is kind of strange, and it works great for green screens. It's the only situation in which it's the only situation I would ever use the color spill brush. And its main job is to remove a color cast that is unfortunate and all over your image. Now, there are lots of ways to use it. I go in and just go up to my tool options bar and click on the override button. Once I do that, I'm just going to click and drag. And as I do so, it's going in and it's removing some of the colors in the tights. Now, the color spill brush, I'm going to undo that really quick so that I can show you guys how it works even better. It responds to something called the colors pane. In your right-hand side colors adjustments here, you can see that you get these things called the keep and drop colors. And these are very, very important when you're using the color spill brush. And the reason why is because you want to tell the program what colors you want to keep and what colors you want to remove. They respond to these two eyedroppers that are on the left-hand side, the drop color and the keep color eyedropper tools. So what I like to do is I start out and I use the keep color eyedropper and select it. And I go in and I choose the colors that I want to make sure are saved. So I don't want to click where this green hue is out here. We don't want to select that weird greenish gray. I want to go in closer to the center where there's less of a color cast and click. We're pulling that kind of bluish gray. And I can do the same for many of the other colors that are in the image. So that's going to include things like her skin. I'm going to zoom out again. That's going to include things like her skin. So we want to make sure we save her skin color. We want to make sure that we save her hair color and so on. So I go through and anything that may have a color cast on it, I want to save the colors that are important to me. Then I'll go down and we're going to do the same thing that we did before. We're going to choose our color spill tool and we're going to click and we're going to drag. And it's going to remove more of the color cast than it did before because we went through and we were more specific about the colors that we wanted to keep. And we can do the same for other parts of our image as well. We can run this across areas like her hair, and it's going to try and remove some of that greenish cast and so on. Now, if you run it across your entire image, it does a pretty good job of removing a cast from the entire photo. It depends on whether you like to use it in segments, larger or smaller. So for me, I don't need to remove a color cast up near her head. I just want to remove it on her tights, so I don't need to run this brush across the entire image. It's not really going to make much of a difference for me. So I'm just going in and using it along her tights. Now, the other thing that's also really important is you can choose a specific color, and this will basically, it goes in and it modifies your foreground color or the color that you want to make sure that you're paying attention to keeping. I don't usually use this. I don't find it quite as useful. I find that if I'm very specific about my keep colors and the colors that I want to remove, for instance, the horrible green color of the background, the color spill brush will work the best. But do make sure that you have override color selected or you're going to run into a whole bunch of very weird problems. So we'll go in and we'll run it across her rings really quick. And again, we'll make sure that we run it across her tights. And those, again, are the most important areas here that we want to make sure we're paying attention to. We're removing the green from her tights, and we're removing the green from the little reflections that were on her ring. Now, when we're done here and we click apply and we go back into layers, I'm not going to go through the entire process because you guys saw me do it before, but I have the ability to go in and edit these two images separately. There are a lot of different ways that I can do that. For this final image, I ended up using a light photo filter to create kind of that, I guess, orangish reddish tone that you're going to see on the image. Whoops. Let's go back up here. I also use something called our sunshine filter on both of the images, and it adds a high contrast, high saturation look so that her hair is nice and bright. All of the colors on her clothes are nice and bright, and then the background image still maintains all of those bright colors from things like the sky and the sand. So those were kind of my unifying filters for these two images to pull them together to make sure that they worked. Again, I'm not going to do it for this image because we're running out of time and I want to make sure there are a couple questions that I can answer. But you can see that there's a big difference between the image that we're starting out with after we've gotten our mask to the image that we ended up with here after applying filters. And it's going to be very similar to what we did with this image, where we started out with two photos that didn't look like they went together and we added unifying filters to make them look together.